Right, now we're going to hone in on one particular challenge, the challenge of climate change, and indeed, where to next. So we know that in the last 12 months, there's been this huge shift in net zero commitments from everyone, and even the government. The pressure is on to close coal-fired power stations earlier and earlier. Households seem pretty comfortable and relaxed at the moment. So this is a really moving space, we all know this. Kicking off is Cameron Adams, co-founder and chief product officer at Canva, with a presentation. And then joining me on the panel will be board director Dr. Sarah Ryan and BCA chairman Tim Reed. So please have your questions ready. Now, just how Cam Adams, with his two co-founders, built a global visual communications platform is a great Australian story. In under 10 years, Canva has grown to over 65 million monthly users across 190 countries, growing faster than Atlassian, and some say its value is $55 billion. Cameron heads up the design and product teams that drives that innovation and growth. So how does Canva think about climate? Cameron, over to you.
Thank you, Ticky. I'll get my slides up. Before I begin, I just want to say this is, just like you, probably my first live event in over 2 years, and it is amazing to see hundreds of real faces that aren't constrained to some mini Zoom windows. So thank you for being here. Good morning. My name's Cameron Adams. I'm one of the co-founders and chief product officer at Canva. And we are a company that started here in Australia, but we span multiple countries now. We have offices in Sydney, we have offices in the US, in China, in the UK, and also in continental Europe. And we now have over 2,500 people working at Canva with us. As Ticky mentioned, we're a visual communications platform that basically brings design to anyone that can't design. So using Canva, you can create amazing content from posters through to presentations, social media graphics, and even a t-shirt if you really wanted to. We now have 75 million people using the product every month around the world. And what we find really amazing about that number is that it's an incredible amount of people that we can have positive impact through. For the last 9 years, we have built our business on looking at really huge challenges and finding the opportunity in them. And I think there is no bigger challenge at the moment than climate change. And we firmly believe that in every crisis, there is an opportunity, and there is opportunity in climate change as well. The scientific consensus cannot be any clearer. Climate change is the biggest threat to global stability, security, and life on Earth that we have ever seen. We're already feeling its effects, from rising global temperatures all around the world to the catastrophic bushfires that we've been experiencing not only recently, but 2 years ago, and of course, to the many, many people that are currently suffering through record floods throughout Queensland and New South Wales right now. All of these are the effects of climate change, and these are the effects that we need to rapidly address and change through the actions that we're taking. When you look at something like the planetary climate system, it can sometimes be very overwhelming. What can we do to change this monolithic thing that involves billions of people and masses of flora and fauna all around the world? But in that challenge, I think we have to figure out the steps that we can take personally. And when thinking about climate change, it's not going to be one parliamentary bill or one power station that makes the difference. It's going to be the actions of all of us. It's going to be the actions of all of us taking small steps and big steps. And it's going to require all of us to work together. It's not just one person, it's not just one organization. One of the core values that we actually have at Canva is to be a force for good. And it's something that attracts a lot of people to Canva, this value. They want to work somewhere that is having a positive impact on the world and contributing not only through its product, but through the actions it takes around the world, through its customers, and through the decisions that we make. We affectionately call people that work at Canva Canvanauts. And this value really resonates with them and drives their passion for the work that they do at Canva. Being a force for good at Canva takes many forms, from helping people out who have lost their homes through bushfires and hurricanes, through to working with local suppliers who can provide our kitchen with healthy and sustainable produce, and even to partnering with community groups who are helping to bridge the gaps for the homeless and the hungry. None of these things falls under the definitions of doing business in the traditional way, but we believe that being a force for good is an important part of being a business in the 21st century, because you cannot claim to be a part of a balanced and sustainable society without thinking deeply about your own effect upon that society. Tackling climate change and thinking about our own ability to reduce carbon emissions is one of the ultimate ways of being a force for good, because it's directly helping the future of the entire planet and everyone on it. It infuriates me when people say that our actions or the actions of our country aren't going to affect climate change in any bit. I think it's the height of hypocrisy to demand change and action from other people when you're not taking the same steps yourself. As one of the world's fastest growing technology companies, we're used to setting crazy big goals and figuring out what we need to do to achieve them. We set ourselves our climate goals 2 years ago. And our climate goals were to be fully powered by renewable energy by 2023 and to be net zero by 2030. To do this, we actually set up a very small framework for ourselves in order to understand exactly the steps that we had to take to decarbonise all the work that we're doing. And it's a very simple kind of inverted pyramid, with offsets being the very first step you can take, followed by reductions, thinking about what you can reduce in your processes, how to reduce the amount of emissions you have, reduce the number of things that require carbon emissions. And very lastly, and probably the best and most effectual step you can take, is to remove emissions entirely from your frameworks. Get rid of the things that are causing carbon emissions, not only reducing them. If we think about the first step, which is offsetting, offsetting is actually one of the easiest steps you can take, although one which has a direct financial impact, but that's the whole point of offsets. And in order to properly offset your emissions, it's important to collect the right data. We've moved from a situation where every year we have to go to some consultants and get them to come in and figure out what our emissions are, to a constantly on data stream where we know exactly what our emissions are day to day. And this really helps us to figure out not only the amount that we need to offset, but also the reductions that we're seeing through the processes that we're approving and the efficiencies that we're introducing. Once you have that data about your carbon emissions, reductions become a bit of a creative exercise. You need to identify the areas where your greatest emissions are coming from and figure out ways to start using less of them. This can involve better management of your waste streams, or doing small things like changing the lighting in your office, or even the scheduling of your heating and your air conditioning systems. There's countless ways in which you can look at the processes and the stuff that you do in your offices and reduce the amount of carbon emissions that are coming out of them. But the third step is probably the most important, and it's the one that's going to get us the furthest towards dealing with climate change. Removing your usage of emitting technologies is where you can have the biggest impact, because it moves you closer to what we call true zero, that point where your systems and processes aren't emitting any carbon at all. One of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gases worldwide is the production of electricity, and particularly the production of electricity using fossil fuels. Getting onto renewable energy is a critical step in tackling climate change, as once we have the right renewable energy infrastructure in place, we can then begin electrifying a bunch of other emitting technologies, such as transport. We actually set ourselves the goal of having all of our offices around the world powered by renewable energy by 2023. And our Sydney office hit that goal at the start of 2021. By implementing what we call a power purchase agreement, which directly gets electricity from a solar farm in Western New South Wales. This agreement guarantees that Canva is paying for and directly adding to the grid the exact amount of electricity that we're consuming. And it makes sure that the renewable energy is going into the grid and being additive and allowing the renewable energy companies to increase their capacity and increase their infrastructure. This change in reductions can also be affected with each of our suppliers as well. Outside of energy consumption in our own offices, by far Canva's largest consumer of electricity is our IT infrastructure. As a cloud computing company, providing our service to our customers and storing their data incurs a lot of server costs. Working with databases, running search engines, serving up everyone's content. We've actually worked with our data provider, AWS, Amazon's Web Services, to move all of our servers across to renewable energy. And we've been working actually closely in partnership with them on a carbon footprint calculator tool, which easily lets us see how much our servers are consuming, what percentage of that is renewable energy, and the reductions that we've seen over the last years in our carbon emissions. It's fantastic work by Amazon, and I strongly encourage anyone to check out their systems if they're truly interested in removing carbon from their IT infrastructure. These types of discussions have started cascading all the way through our supply chain. So not only from our digital infrastructure providers, but through to our physical printing providers, to delivery services, and even our kitchen suppliers. Once you start on this journey of decarbonisation, it's a ripple effect that has you talking to your partners, working with them together to reduce emissions, and helping them level up their game in terms of climate change as well. Last year, we were also the first Australian organisation to join the Climate Pledge, which is a group of organisations who have committed to reaching net zero by 2040, which is 10 years ahead of the Paris Agreement. Our contribution to this challenge will actually see Canva reach net zero by next year. But we don't plan to just stop at net zero. We have set ambitious targets to go beyond net zero and start regenerating and replenishing the environment through programs like our One Print, One Plant program, which plants a tree for every print order that's put through Canva. There are a fantastic amount of people at Canva who care deeply about the environment. And being a force for good helps us attract some of the most brightest minds in the world, because they want to be working at a company that is not only tackling exciting product challenges, but is doing so in a way that is a clear positive impact on the planet. And it's these people that come to Canva and make it the company that it is. We've hired more than 1,300 people last year, and we plan to rapidly scale that again this year. We actually received 240,000 job applications last year, which is an incredible number, and it's a lot of work for our people team. But we fully expect that number to grow and increase as more people see the positive impact that they can have through the work that they do at Canva. It's a virtuous cycle between being a force for good and building a great company. We see a real opportunity to drive change and a real chance for Australia, individual Australians, Australian companies, and the Australian government to set goals that will drive the change we need. Australia is a very fortunate country with an amazing economy. And we think that that is a great foundation for the next stage of what Australia's economy should be in a world that's adequately dealing with climate change. There is untold innovation and opportunities ahead for companies that embrace decarbonisation. And we think that if Australia can lead the way, it can be a major player on the world stage. With any problem worth solving, you must always undertake a lot of learning to do it. And you're inevitably going to need to change and adapt as you figure it out. We don't have it all figured out. We don't know the exact spot we're going to get to by the year 2030. But we are damn well going to try our hardest. And we're going to learn along the way and learn about how to decarbonise, how to tackle climate change, and spread that out to other people. That's what a lot of Canva is about. It is about teaching other people our learnings, bringing them on the journey, and helping the whole field level up. With that, I'd love to go back to the panel, and thank you for listening.
Good. How good is this company, really? It is an extraordinary story from where you've come to in just so few years, so well done. Now, let me bring in our other two panelists. Dr. Sarah Ryan with me here. She's a physicist, geophysicist, and she sits on an extraordinary cross-section of boards in this companies in this space, I think. So if we talk about Oz Minerals and Horizon and Woodside Petroleum and Viva Energy and the future batteries industry, CRC. And then joining us from Sydney is Tim Reed. He's been President of the Business Council of Australia since 2017, which again represents an incredible spread of big businesses. Tim's also a director at Transurban and spent 12 years as chief executive of MYOB. So he's done the whole young tech thing to becoming now one of the real grown-ups in the room, Tim, I'd say. So look, welcome all. Cam, quickly one to you. I just thought one of the things that you said that sort of kind of makes you really angry is the hypocrisy of some folk who criticize without making the changes themselves. What sort of people are we talking about here? Are we talking about some investors? Are we talking about companies? Or
I think particularly here in Australia, we sell ourselves short. And I think if we just looked at the impact that we could have on Australia when we're building Canva, we would probably be a company about 1/100th the size of what we are now. And I think the impact that the actions that Australians can have, particularly in a developed economy, is huge, because taking that step to say that we're going to reach net zero encourages a whole bunch of industries to figure out ways that we can do that. And we can truly lead the way in both technology and corporate governance as to how to achieve that. And those effects will be felt around the world. So it's not just about eliminating the 0.5 or the 1% of carbon emissions that Australia actually produces. It's the effect we can have on everyone else around the world for setting a model for how it can be done.
Tim, you obviously have been wrestling with these issues with all sorts of different big companies. I'm just wondering if you can give us a sense of how you see the business world and also the grid, really, in terms of the progress that we're making and the risk that boards have now.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ticky. So in terms of the progress business is making, I think there's been a massive shift in the last 2 or 3 years. The BCA consulted with all of our members over an 18-month process that concluded towards the end of 2021, so sort of through 2020 and 2021. And it surprised us even through that time how far our members moved. The consensus there was, and this is bottoms up from our members, that business believes that we will reduce Australia's emissions over the 2005 level by somewhere between 46 and 50% by 2030, which is obviously far more ambitious than either of the main political parties have as a policy at this point in time. And the shift that came with that is that no one is debating whether we need to get to net zero and whether business needs to lead, it's how. And the how is then incredibly varied. So Cam just gave some great examples from Canva of things that they're doing, but different businesses are in very different situations. And we've got those that are in the electricity network, and I'll come to the grid in a minute, Ticky. We've got those that are heavy industrial producers of carbon emissions, and those where, frankly, their scope 2 is the main element of their emissions, so electricity. Just on the grid, the thing that we've all seen, and frankly it's been playing out week to week, has been the conversation around the decarbonisation of the grid, and that's a multifaceted challenge. But what we are seeing now is that renewables are the cheapest source of electricity feeding into the grid, and the main challenge becomes transmission and storage or firming of those. And what our work did was 2 things. One was look at what we think is the economically optimal path for Australia to reduce emissions. And that said that we should be at about 53% by 2030, with the electricity grid decarbonising by 90% by 2030. And then went to our members, which include Energy Australia, Origin, AGL, etc., and said, well, what do you think is feasible? and the bottom up was more at a 75 to 80% decarbonisation of the electricity grid by 2030. So there is a little spread between what's sort of economically optimal, forget about environmentally optimal, but just economically optimal, and where those companies believe the grid will be. But it is all pointing towards a far more rapid decarbonisation of electricity between now and 2030 than the economically useful life of those plants when they were originally built. And frankly, roughly aligns to where AEMO's latest projections and forecasts are for the electricity grid.
So, Sarah, let me bring you in here. Now, obviously, the elephant in the room is what all these fossil fuel companies, the pace that they're being pushed. We're now actually seeing AGL in play because some people really want to drive things faster, and they're potentially putting their money there to do it. So as you are sitting on the board of Woodside, we've got a report which has just landed today, just for you, I'm sure, from the investor group on climate change. Now, they maintain that, and they've got $33 trillion, they say, represent $33 trillion in assets under management. And they say that basically the climate plans for Australia's corporations are inadequate, and specifically in relation to Woodside, they'd say that Meg O'Neill's, $5 billion for climate change is dwarfed by the $16 billion development in Scarborough, a new gas development. So how do you come back on that?
Yeah, you start with an easy question. We think of it in, so number one, we take the whole decarbonisation of the company and the economy, the global economy, and Woodside's part in it extremely seriously. So speaking from the board perspective, it is absolutely top of mind. It is in every discussion, in every board meeting, in every committee. So I'll just put that out there. If we think about emissions, there's Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Scope 1 is the company's own emissions from what it does. Scope 2 is the emissions from the electricity that it uses. So that's in the company's control. And then Scope 3 is the use of its product. So in an oil and gas producer like Woodside, it's the combustion of the oil and the gas molecules in power or whatever that a lot of the focus is on from groups like this and from many people for good reasons. So if I first talk about Scope 1 and 2 for Woodside, it's what it can control. So Woodside has publicly committed to reducing its Scope 1 and 2 by 15% in 2025 and 30% in 2030 and be a net zero by 2050. So that's what it can control. With a combination of, it's exactly what Cameron just said, of operate out, do things better, design out things in the future to be as close to zero as you can get them, and what you can't get with that, you offset with high quality, primarily Australian offsets. So that's the stuff in the company's control. So that's one thing. Woodside decided to make a separate climate report, and it's out for investors to vote on in the upcoming annual general meeting in a couple of months' time. So we'll see if investors think that's good enough soon. Now, on the Scope 3, that's where that question's coming from. It's like the molecules you produce in the world,
Yeah, and you've got this merger that's got to be voted on by shareholders with BHP Petroleum. So you're doubling down on gas, basically, on fossil fuels,
Well, you can look at it like the assets. If the deal goes ahead, the assets belong to BHP Petroleum, and then it will belong to the merged company. So the fields are there and they're operating, so that hasn't changed that at all. It's the ownership that will change. Yeah. But in terms of Scarborough, I'll say that most of what Woodside produces is LNG. It sends it to Asia, to developed and developing Asia, to run power. So in essence, keeping the lights on in Tokyo and supplying power to developing Asia. So if you have to think about their decarbonisation plans, so I think nearly every country that Woodside sells to has themselves committed to net zero. So that country has their own plans, and our little bit of LNG sits within their big decarbonisation plans. The the new energies for Woodside is mostly thinking around ammonia and hydrogen, so that's low carbon products for the same customers that they can use to develop, to create power and to run their industries so that goes into their equation of moving their economies to net zero. So we want to be part of their solution.
Yeah,
that's how
look,
we see it.
I mean, this is a difficult, let's face it, difficult message to get across to the public. Think global for a start, and think about the transition. So, Tim, if I throw this idea to you that we're suddenly getting some major investors and big voices like Mark Carney at Brookfield, and even Graham Hunt at AGL, saying, look, you've got to be, if you really want to pull emissions down, you've got to be in there with the fossil fuels, actually supporting, investing in, and helping their transition. I mean, Graham would say, if I shut down a coal power stations, I'm going to blow everybody out in terms of my emissions reduction. So how can boards on these sorts of companies get that message across to their investors, to their financiers, and to the community?
Yeah, so you're 100% right, Ticky. You just can't turn these things off because it would have a devastating effect on people and life, around the world. But equally, if we don't transition and don't make the change, we'll have a devastating effect on people and life around the world. Australia is in a very unique position, and this goes back to some of the points Cam was saying about how annoying he finds it when people sort of diminish the contribution that we can each make. Australia is a high-income economy that is very carbon intensive, and that's quite unique. If you think about the world where it is and what Sarah was talking about, us keeping the lights on in Tokyo, for us, the transition is more challenging, but we have a bigger opportunity to make a contribution to global decarbonisation than almost anyone. Because we have been in a world where energy has been relatively expensive to extract, but relatively cheap to transport and cheap to store. And we're moving to a world where energy is relatively cheap to extract, but very expensive to transport and expensive to store. Because, solar, the sun, the wind, you can actually extract that energy at very low marginal or zero marginal cost. But the process that Sarah said Woodside are working on in terms of ammonia and hydrogen, the challenge is hydrogen's very, very small, so it escapes as it's being transported very easily. And the processes for ammonia, while more stable, are still quite expensive in terms of storage. So this is a complex message, and it's a complex message to get out there. And different stakeholders will rightfully argue one point of view because they're trying to push and influence companies to move further down their path. And that's what happens in a democracy. And, particularly this week, let's all be thankful that we live in a free democracy where we can have exchange of ideas and we can have different viewpoints. I think what boards need to do is exactly the path Sarah just spoke about. They need to be very clear and very transparent in what they're doing. They do need to set targets, but they've also got to be very clear on how they're going to go after hitting those and achieving those targets. And there are unknowns. In the work that we did at the BCA, we absolutely believe using commercially viable technology, companies can drive Australia's emissions down by 50% by 2030. But the 50% after that is going to be harder. And there are not commercially viable solutions to getting down to net zero at this point in time. And so boards need to be transparent, they need to be upfront, they need to be honest about what they're doing, what they can control, and where they're spending time, R&D, collaborations that they're driving to try and get over some of those barriers that they're going to have to stare into in the 2030 to 2050 years.
Yeah. Cameron, obviously the tech sector is a big part of this as well. I mean, in terms of the user of power and the growing use of power, and some would question the ethics of, for example, Bitcoin mining, if it's not done at the right time. Now, there's one question here come through from Malcolm Crompton. Canva is making massive use of solar. What are its plans for the end of life of this infrastructure, solar panels and lithium batteries?
Interesting question. I think there's rapid innovation even in that space. So recycling of solar panels, although it's not available on a large scale, there's definitely companies here in Australia that are focusing on that. And I think, kind of talking to Tim's point around uncertainty, like you always have to be comfortable with a certain level of uncertainty. And this would not be a challenge. Climate change would not be a challenge if everything was sorted out. If we knew all the answers, if we knew exactly how every company was going to decarbonise and there was an orderly plan for transition over the next 10 years, we wouldn't be in the spot where we are.
So it's really interesting what you say about the importance of your messages and how attractive that is for talent, when you're trying to attract talent, many of whom I imagine are very young and very much on the climate change bandwagon. But what does that then, are they now asking questions about disposal of batteries, and that sort of green issue that is still unresolved?
They should very much be asking those questions. And I very much hope that someone at Canva is going to start a company which deals with problems with batteries and solar panels and all of that stuff. But I think we know the path ahead is clear. Fossil fuels need to be removed, and we need to electrify as much as we can and remove to renewable energy as quickly as we can.
Yep.
I'm very confident that putting a big, audacious goal in front of us brings out the best in people, and we find solutions to these things. And we're a lot more aware of the externalities now than we were 60 years ago when we were happily putting smoke into the air and not worrying about it.
Exactly. Sarah, how do you see the battery challenge?
The battery challenge?
Well, in terms of actually dealing with or recycling of a lot of the products. I mean, it takes quite a lot of energy to make a lot of these products, and then we've got the recycling challenge the other end, which seems to be, in the manana basket at the moment, in the hope that our ingenuity will solve the problem.
I think you're absolutely spot on, Ticky, because at the battery industry CRC, so it's not about future batteries, it's about the future battery industry, to try and encourage us not just to mine the battery minerals, but to participate in the whole value chain, including the recycle and reuse to make a circular economy. And you're right, everyone agrees it's something that needs to be done, and everyone would like someone else to deal with it. So there's no answer on the commerciality or the safety or who's going to do it and how they're going to make money. There are no guidelines or regulatory authorities or anything yet. It's a thing that needs to be worked on. A lot of enthusiasm, a lot of agreement that it must be done. But there's not much happening.
Right. Tim, how much is happening from the government side on climate change?
So the government's doing a lot, and I think the focus that they have really had are on some of these issues we've been talking about in terms of their tech roadmap. So the government went out last year, maybe it was 2 years ago, and defined 6 areas that they were really going to support R&D going into, that they thought were 6 of the critical things that needed to be solved for that 2030 to 2050 sort of very difficult to abate emissions. And this included things like lowering the cost of soil carbon measurement, because there's great economics in soil carbon, except that it's incredibly expensive to measure and therefore difficult to verify, and therefore the economics start to fall away. It was, their $2 hydrogen goal and the R&D that needs to go into that. And so there is good work that's being done there. I think there is more that could be done. The funding for the CFC and ARENA is absolutely critical, and they have continued to fund that, and governments of both sides have continued to fund those organisations.
But in terms of the actual transition, I mean, is it a question that corporate Australia is just moving on and the government's kind of getting out of the way, or what?
in the range of now to 2030, it's being driven by business and by the state governments overwhelmingly. The federal government policy in that area is, I think, lagging where business is today.
Sarah, you agree with that?
Yes. Yeah, the businesses I'm involved in are absolutely just getting on with it. I'll give you one small anecdote. Horizon run locomotives for bulk and minerals and so forth. So that's one of the hard-to-abate things that Tim was just mentioning. So some of their locomotives run on the Queensland, they're electrical, so that grid's decarbonising, so that's great. But others run, they're just diesel locomotives, so there's no cut and paste to replace a diesel locomotive right now with a battery operated locomotive. So they're doing trials on hydrogen locomotives to see if that will even be an issue. So that's not being driven by government, that's just being by Horizon saying, listen, this is our scope 1, and we need to self-help and we need to work out what we can do. And so they're doing this whole range of pilot projects on what you can do to take the diesel out of the equations.
Yeah. Cameron, just another one from the floor. How do you decarbonise the emissions of your remote workers who work from home? How are you tracking or managing this? Have you got any thoughts on?
Yeah, we're actually taking that into account, and the power purchase agreement that I mentioned before, where we get the renewable energy for the office. We're in the process of kind of bleeding that out to everyone that's working remotely as well. So at the moment, we actually just apply, we don't quite have the right measurements, so we're kind of overcompensating. So we just kind of put in a figure that we know is over for people that are working at home, and then offset that ourselves. But we're working towards actually measuring that.
So but you are actually offsetting it at the moment. Yeah. Now, look, there's one question that's come to the top here, which I will start with Tim on. But it's true of energy. It's true of a lot of things. The concentration of funds has the potential to destabilise world order. How big is too big, and how ethical is it for non-elected leaders to have so much power in society, Tim?
Yeah, you're certainly throwing the tough questions out today, Ticky. So let me start at the end there. There is no doubt that capital is becoming more active. And so there was a point in time, I think, when everyone understood that capital needed to earn a return. Everyone understood that different investment managers would be trying to find the investment returns, the risk-return profile that best suited the investors that they were representing. And it just seemed like a very simple equation. And so it was always a huge part of the economy. If we went back to the founding of this nation, when the big infrastructure projects were first put in place, capital had to be there, it had to be raised, it was always imported, but it was, I think people felt like they understood it and they understood what it was seeking, and therefore it was fairly silent and fairly anonymous. I think the difference today is that capital is saying, well, of course I need to get a return, but I also want to know how that return is being generated. And therefore, I want to know that it's being generated in ways that are, in my standards, ethically aligned to what my investors want. I want to know that, that there's modern slavery is not part of the supply chain of this capital. I want to know that the carbon emissions are, I'd like to know what they are, and I'd like to know that they're being lowered over time, and so on. And it's those other elements that I think cause this question to be asked, as to sort of unelected officials having undue power across society. I come back to the point that I think transparency is absolutely critical in this. And so I think that what investors need to be doing is making sure, just as companies need to be transparent, so does capital need to be transparent. And you look at someone like BlackRock and, is BlackRock too big is kind of the question that's being asked here, I think. I don't think that BlackRock is too big. I don't know in terms of the global investment community what they are, but they would be small single-digit percentages, if not sub 1% of the total capital pool in the world. And any competition regulator who saw a provider of a service that was in small single-digit percentages would not say that that is too powerful. But what they are doing is exercising that voice more loudly. And I think that that is being driven by the fact that they believe that the people that they represent want that voice to be shared.
But you're talking about transparency, creating more transparency for private equity, which seems to me to be almost an oxymoron, and also creating more transparency in, say, industry funds, which are the big rise of industry funds represented on the register of so many public listed companies now. Are we going to see the spotlight turned around, a bit of pressure put on industry funds on the disclosure front?
I think it would be helpful if the transparency went across all parts of the financial system. So we've talked about proxy advisors, I think about investors, absolutely. I think that in the end, that is how people get comfort in the fact that these aren't sort of backroom deals that are being done, but that there is better transparency across all components of the investment value chain.
Okay, just a couple now, Cameron first, on governance structures generally. There's quite a lot of interest in what your governance structures are at Canva, because you've grown obviously so fast. So how do you set up your board? Do you have subcommittees that deal with things like climate change and particular risks, and do you audit that, and how does that all work?
We probably push more out to the executive than we do to the board. The board, we've managed to keep fairly small at Canva, but we have brought along a few investors that we've brought on over the years, and they've been really helpful in kind of helping us figure out the scale at which we're operating. So we started out as a 3-person company and have grown now to close to 3,000. And dealing with that, dealing with all these markets around the world, even dealing with different governments around the world when different regulations come in different countries, having that board level kind of network there to help us navigate that, understand what we should be doing at this level of scale has been really valuable for us.
Yeah, yeah. And so if I jump to Sarah, ask the same question, because you're sitting on the board of companies that are listed, been very established for many years. How are they tweaking, if you like, their governance to deal with climate change and energy transition, accountability, measuring, audits, that sort of thing?
I would say overall it's been embedded in the current board and committee structure. So audit and risk committees are including the climate-related risks, this is, that kind of thing. The sustainability committee, so in my sector it's common to have a sustainability committee, which used to be HSE, now health, safety, environment, sustainability, climate change and so forth. It's come under that. They do a lot of the heavy lifting. And then of course the board, it's like I said at the beginning, it's top of mind for board, and it's embedded in everything from the thinking, from the company strategy to the way we think about our capital allocation framework even to the organisation of the chief executive's team and things like that. It's just embedded in everything now. But it's been a journey to get there of at least 2-3 years, if not more, to put it all through. But it comes in 2 parts, Ticky. It's the I'll just call it climate change risk part, because you have to start putting climate change related risks into your financials and so forth. So that all happens. And then there's the part around strange noise.
A canary.
Yeah, put off my thought now. Okay, yes. Particularly from companies like Woodside, it's the new decarbonised energy. It's and Viva Energy too, running the Geelong refinery and so forth. It's what new products and services are we going to supply in this new world? So I think yesterday it was announced that for Viva they're going to build and deliver a hydrogen refuelling station for trucks near the Geelong refinery. So they're going to go into the green hydrogen business. And of course, lots of people know what Woodside's up to. So it's the two halves of it. It's sort of like the classical climate risk, but there's also the climate, the decarbonisation as a new business opportunity. So that all has been joined onto the business, and then the board is covering that as well.
That's great. I should add that some of these hard questions that are coming, allegedly hard questions, certainly not just from me. It's Jackie McGill, I think was the last one on the big funds, and another one from Narelle Hooper, who says the big questions recently over the integrity of offsets. There are a lot of them. Climate Change Authority is reviewing the issue after NGOs blew the whistle. How can boards be confident of the integrity of their offset schemes? Perhaps one for you again, Sarah.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and it is absolutely top of mind. And directors, we keep asking this of management when we talk about the offsets, like how are you sure, and how can you make us comfortable that these are real offsets that are really going to do the job? And the answer has been mostly that you concentrate on good quality, visible Australian offsets that go through all the oh gosh, I'm having the offset regulator. I can't remember the name. Anyway,
carbon offset regulator.
Clean energy regulator.
That's them. Thank you.
AER. Yes,
that's them. So you can see the project. You can see where it is and what they're doing, whether it's fire management or whether it's natural vegetation, plantation, and stuff like that. So it's very, very transparent. And in most companies, they're doing it in the areas where they operate. So you've got, which is even better, you've got the local traditional owners involved, so you've got the businesses. For them, they can start up, you're supporting that. It's rural and regional employment, it's small business. It's really, really good things that you can make happen, purely for the company wanting offsets, but it can be done in a very, very helpful way for the local community as well.
Yeah.
So that's the number one thing, Australian high-quality ACCUs. Number one, and preferably. So for Woodside, for example, they still need to generate quite a substantial volume of offsets. So they actually started a new business where they've actually gone into leasing and buying large amounts of land in Western Australia, which was sort of partially degraded, really marginal land that nothing was happening, and basically supporting local businesses to be replanting and reseeding native vegetation.
Yeah.
And, it was all properly audited and everything like that. So it's quite a piece of work, and it's a very good question that's top of mind.
Yeah. And how do you see, are you much into this, Cameron, or that doesn't seem to...
Yeah, no, I think the point you really make about local connection is really important. And we've tried to do that with the offsets that we've purchased as well. Obviously, the Australian carbon credits are well vetted and really well checked. But when thinking about like a global company and the different offices that we have, and the connection that our employees around the world need to feel to the work that we're doing, we've also looked at offsets around the world as well.
And I guess the next question is, maybe through to Tim again, where are we with this carbon offset trading? Because, we do have young companies like Expansive and that sort of thing who are trying to develop a proper offset market. Can we actually see one there, and how important is that?
Yeah, we're right in the infancy, and it is critical. And so we've got to be very careful with the way in which we progress forward from here. But, almost any plan that has Australia hitting net zero by 2050 says that something like 20% of the emissions reduction will be so expensive that it's not feasible, and therefore we need offsets. And, that's probably 100 million tonnes a year that has to be offset. So it's a significant amount, and lots of the great opportunities for offsets take years to build as well. So we need to get started early. Sarah spoke about some of the great work Woodside are doing, and they were absolutely one of the first out of the gates with this. But when you're talking about native vegetation, you can't just create a forest overnight. It takes time, and the carbon abatement potential of the actions that you take today will grow and grow over time. The offset markets are immature. The government really started to seed these, and that's been a great role that the government's played over the last 8 years. In the last 12 months, the price of carbon credits have more than doubled, and that is as commercial voluntary offsetting is taking a bigger and bigger place. And I think we'd all much rather that be the primary driver of the market. There's still another 5 years plus, Ticky, of I'd say, the market being established. The question around the quality of the offsets, that's also going to improve over time as we learn. The Clean Energy Regulator has to approve methods before that can be used to create an ACCU. And we need more methods to deepen the market. But as we create more methods, there will be some at the fringe that are criticised. And I suspect the question that was being put to you was about the offsets in Western New South Wales, where there were rights to clear land, and by not clearing the land, the ACCUs were created, but there are arguments that the land was probably never going to be cleared anyway, and we end up in almost a he said, she said. And I think we've got to be very careful not to get caught in those areas, because what that means is the regulator then becomes more apprehensive about creating new methods, and then we strangle the market through a lack of supply, when actually, what we need to be doing is accelerating the market.
Right, goes to credibility, I guess. Now, thank you. Cameron, another pointy one for you. You can handle it, please, for us. This is from Nicole Killen. Foreign correspondent in February ran a show on the dangerous cobalt industry. Cobalt goes in batteries, obviously, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the devastating impact on the communities there. What's Canva's modern slavery and ethical stance around these types of matters, given that cobalt is so critical to batteries, and a large number of children work in this industry?
Yeah, I think it's a very pointy question, but yeah, I think I've watched the same report, and we desperately need to figure out the minerals that we're going to need for the future and how we're actually going to supply them to the world, and how we procure those, what sort of protections we have in place for the workers there, and making sure that we're not mixing this cobalt that's coming from these kind of, what do you call them, kind of almost pirate mines versus the ones that are actually properly regulated.
Yeah. Where's the cobalt in Australia? I'm sure I read something recently about some green light on that. Do you know anything about that, Sarah?
Not off the top of my head.
Yeah,
sorry.
I think there is a bit around. But anyway, it is a challenge. It is certainly a challenge. A couple of questions around nuclear, and in fact, the current most popular one is about nuclear power from Alex Atkins, and what is its future in Australia and internationally. Sarah?
Oh, that's way beyond my pay grade. I'm sorry. I'm really going to take a pass on that.
Right, okay. Well, then definitely I go back to Tim, because you obviously represent all sorts of different companies, including, I would imagine, ones with interest in this question.
Yeah, so look, the real question in nuclear in Australia is a political question. It's not a technology question, because, we're not building nuclear because there's no approval for nuclear development in Australia. And I don't think there's any political appetite to change that. Should there be a political appetite? There's certainly arguments that, that nuclear would be a very good low carbon, because zero carbon, firming capability across the grid. But there's equally, research that's continuing to push down the cost of batteries, pumped hydro. There's actually a company, and they're doing a development up in Queensland at the moment that are using effectively blocks of concrete to replicate the mechanics of pumped hydro, so that you can have small cellular pumped hydro like storage, on site at off-grid facilities, big mines, etc. So there are lots of alternatives to nuclear, but I think the answer is there's no political appetite for nuclear in Australia, and therefore it's highly unlikely that we'll see it.
Right.
It's pretty low. It's pretty low need here in Australia, given we have access to so many renewable resources.
Yes.
But it's obviously for countries, like Austria, that are kind of landlocked and don't have as much renewable resources as we do. A lot of people are kind of nuclear advocates there.
Yeah. Yes, very interesting. But then, of course, France has made a thing of it, hasn't it? So, right. back to you, Cameron, one from Philippa Lewis. What are Canva's thoughts on the support from government for their climate change initiatives?
So support from government for our climate change initiatives?
Yep.
I think we are more than happy to plough ahead. Like, any support that we get from government is fantastic, and we have got fantastic support from the government through R&D grants over the years. But in terms of climate, it is something that is a real values-driven thing for us, and we would do it without government support. And in fact, we do it to kind of drive the government to work harder in this as well.
Sarah, zoning down to the sort of board level, there's a question here about just day-to-day how you as a board member of a fossil fuel legacy company resolve the sort of tensions in day-to-day business ticking over your investments, your jobs, how you deal with sort of investors, and how you encourage people to come and join the company, all that sort of thing, and how you deal with those conversations at board level.
No, that's a really good question, and I think it goes exactly to what Cameron said in his presentation, is to attract talent and keep talent. People, you have to show and demonstrate in reality that you're part of the future and you're part of the solution of decarbonising the global economy. So it may be a little, you have to do a little more talking when it's an oil and gas company, but you have to say exactly what I said before. It is a transition. We're providing fuel to keep the planet going, and we want to be part of the future with the liquid hydrogen, with the ammonia, producing it and then providing it to Asia on a very large scale, which helps them decarbonise their economies on a material scale. So we're going to be part of the future, and also changing how you work the company inside the company, like powering it using more solar power and stuff like that. That's generally to be part of the future. So to us, it's not, you can't just switch off oil and gas tomorrow and then, be all batteries tomorrow. It is a transition. It will take a couple of decades because, as the previous speaker said, and I know it's true, the world uses 100 million barrels of oil a day, right? It's going to take us a while to turn that supertanker around.
Yeah. So we're almost out of time, but Tim, I'd like to come back to you again and ask whether you think that the Ukrainian crisis in particular, but also this, I think our last speaker, Ms. Moyer, was talking about it, this pushback on globalization has had any impact on the energy transition. So we've now got, supply chain problems with energy, and people thinking about much more about security. Does that make this challenge just that much harder?
I don't know that it changes the size of the challenge, but it might turn up the intensity on making progress sooner. So firstly, just on the Ukraine, let's just start by recognising the humanitarian crisis that has been created, and all of our thoughts go out to the people of the Ukraine at this point in time, because first and foremost, that is the impact on lives and families. From an energy perspective, Russia's obviously an enormous energy exporter to Europe, and it will be challenged, I think, in the years ahead as to the support, therefore, that those European countries are giving to a nation that is clearly showing that its values are not aligned to those of most of the rest of the world, and certainly to those of Western Europe. And that is going to become a challenge, and there will be therefore calls for more energy security, for more energy independence, and for questioning and challenging global supply chains. I think for Australia, we've got to be very careful through this. We are a small, wealthy nation who are dependent on global supply chains. We don't have the scale domestically to build many things, and we are very, very good at some things that contribute to those global supply chains. And so, we shouldn't kid ourselves that deglobalisation is going to be incredibly challenging and frankly extraordinarily expensive for us if we went down that path. I think a better path to go down is for companies to really stare into the governance of their supply chain. And you spoke earlier about modern slavery in relation to the cobalt in Africa and so on. I think those are the issues that directors should be getting ahead of, because by getting ahead of that, we can actually give customers, employees, the community at large confidence that we are sharing their values, that we do understand that those things are important to them, and that we don't need to go to extremes of challenging the benefits and the value of global trade. We've just got to make sure that we're doing it with the diligence, caution and care that they would like.
That's a good, strong message to end on. Look, thank you to the audience for your really interesting questions on. I know I haven't been able to get through them all, but thank you very much. It's such an ongoing challenge for us all. Tim, Sarah and Cameron, thank you very much for taking part. Please join me in thanking our panel.